The 1970s were a time of economic gloom in Britain, yet the entertainment industry was booming. While the public tightened their belts, some stars earned fortunes, but refused to spend a single shilling. These icons, despite their millions, lived in shadows, wearing threadbare clothes and walking to save bus fare. They were the misers of the screen, hiding their wealth while pleading poverty. Why did they hoard their gold? Subscribe and tell us, is it thrift or madness? Let us uncover the 10 stars who took their fortunes to the grave. Benny Hill. The first name in our ledger of the spectacularly thrifty is a man who was arguably the most famous British face on the planet during the 1970s. Benny Hill was not just a comedian, he was a global industry. His show was syndicated in over 140 countries, generating rivers of royalties that flooded into his bank accounts every single year. By the middle of the decade, Benny was a multimillionaire many times over, possessing a fortune that could have easily purchased a fleet of Rolls-Royces, a sprawling country estate, and a lifestyle of unbridled luxury. Yet, to the complete bewilderment of his colleagues and the press, the king of comedy chose to live with a frugality that bordered on the ascetic. He was a man who conquered the world of entertainment, but refused to conquer his own deep-seated fear of poverty, living a life that was smaller and simpler than that of the average factory worker who laughed at his sketches. While other television stars of the era were flashing their wealth in exclusive Mayfair clubs and purchasing villas in the south of France, Benny lived in a modest, rented apartment. He famously refused to buy his own property for decades, terrified by the large capital expenditure and the commitment it represented. Visitors to his home were often shocked by the lack of adornment. There were no expensive paintings, no designer furniture, and certainly no domestic staff to manage his affairs. The man who could afford a team of private chefs preferred to shop at the local supermarket, often waiting patiently for the reduced price stickers to appear on goods before placing them in his basket. He was a creature of habit who found comfort in the bargain bin, treating every potential purchase as a direct threat to his financial security. His approach to transport was equally legendary within the industry. Benny Hill never owned a car. In a decade where the ultimate status symbol for a celebrity was a Jaguar or a Bentley, Benny preferred to use his own 2 feet. He would famously walk for miles from his flat to the television studios, not for the sake of his health, but to save the fare of a taxi or a bus. On the rare occasions when he was forced to take a taxi, he was known to ask the driver to stop the cab a significant distance from his actual destination if the meter was ticking too high, preferring to complete the journey on foot rather than part with a few extra shillings. He viewed the concept of luxury transport as a frivolous waste, a trap that sucked money away from the pile he was so carefully accumulating. This extreme economy extended to his wardrobe and his personal maintenance. Despite being on television screens in millions of homes every week, Benny wore the same few casual outfits until they literally fell apart. There are well-documented stories of him using strong glue to fix the soles of his shoes rather than visiting a cobbler or, heaven forbid, buying a new pair. To Benny, buying something new when the old one still functioned, however barely, was a sin against common sense. He was haunted by the idea that his fame was a bubble that could burst at any moment, leaving him with nothing. When he passed away, he left an estate worth over £7 million, a staggering sum for the time, money that he had never touched, never enjoyed, and never shared, serving as the ultimate example of a star who counted every penny until the end. Kenneth Williams. The second figure in our ledger of the parsimonious is a man whose nasal voice and flared nostrils made him one of the most recognizable comedy icons of the 1970s. Kenneth Williams was the flamboyant star of 26 Carry-On films, a radio personality, and a chat show favorite who seemed to be everywhere during the decade. To the public, he was a figure of camp excess and haughty grandeur, but in his private life, Kenneth was ruled by a financial anxiety that bordered on the obsessive. Despite being one of the highest-profile entertainers in the country, he lived a life of extreme austerity, treating every pound note as if it were a rare artifact that must be protected at all costs. His famous diaries revealed a man who did not just track his spending, he agonized over the price of a cup of coffee with a detail that was startling. Throughout the 1970s, while his contemporaries were upgrading to large houses, Kenneth remained in a small, rented flat near Regent's Park. He refused to buy a property, viewing mortgages and maintenance costs as a trap, preferring a simple rental arrangement where he could control his outgoings with military precision. His home was famously Spartan. He did not believe in buying new furniture if the old items were still functional, regardless of how worn they appeared. Visitors were often surprised to find that the great star lived in an environment that looked more like the quarters of a strict schoolmaster than the home of a celebrity. He famously refused to employ a cleaner, preferring to scrub his own floors to save the wages. His approach to professional expenses was equally severe. For a significant part of his career, Kenneth acted as his own agent. He did this not because he enjoyed the negotiation process — he famously hated confrontation — but because he could not bear the thought of parting with the standard 10% commission fee. He would rather negotiate a lower fee for himself and keep the entirety of it than secure a higher fee and share a slice. This mindset often led to him being underpaid, but to Kenneth, the saving of the commission was the victory. He was penny-wise but pound-foolish, trapping himself in low-paying contracts because the immediate saving was more tangible than long-term gain. Socially, Kenneth was known for his short arms and deep pockets. He loathed the custom of buying rounds of drinks and would often engineer situations where he could avoid paying his share at dinner. There are numerous anecdotes from the carry-on cast about Kenneth vanishing when the bill arrived or meticulously calculating his exact portion down to the halfpenny to avoid subsidizing anyone else's meal. He viewed tipping as an unnecessary extravagance and would often leave the bare minimum, if anything at all. He preferred to eat in inexpensive cafeterias or take simple meals at home rather than waste money on fine dining. This relentless frugality was driven by a deep dread. Kenneth was convinced that his career could end at any moment, and he needed a financial fortress to protect him. When he passed away in 1988, he left an estate valued at just over £500,000, a substantial fortune for the time, money that had been accumulated through decades of self-denial. He spent his life preparing for a rainy day that never came, leaving behind a bank account full of unspent cash. Rod Stewart. The third figure in our audit of the affluent pinch pennies is a man who defined the rock and roll excess of the 1970s. Rod Stewart was the raspy-voiced superstar who dominated the charts with global hits like Maggie May and Sailing. To the public, he was the ultimate playboy, draped in leopard print, driving yellow Lamborghinis and dating blonde models. However, behind the glamorous facade lay a financial discipline that would have impressed a Victorian banker. Rod was not just careful with money, he was famously tight-fisted, a trait that became a running joke among his bandmates and the rock fraternity. Despite earning millions from record sales and sell-out stadium tours, he treated his wallet like an onion. Opening it was a rare event that often brought tears to his eyes. One of the most enduring legends about Rod's frugality involves his domestic management. It was widely whispered in the industry that he would mark the levels of fruit juice and mineral water bottles in his refrigerator with a pen before leaving the house. This was to ensure that his cleaning staff or guests were not secretly consuming his beverages while he was away. On some occasions, he was even accused of refilling expensive bottled water containers with tap water to avoid buying replacements, a level of thrift that seemed absurd for a man who owned mansions on 2 continents. He viewed these small household consumables not as trivialities, but as assets to be guarded against the freeloaders who he felt surrounded him. Socially, Rod developed a reputation for having short arms whenever the bill arrived at a restaurant. Associates from the 1970s recounted numerous instances where the singer would suddenly develop a fascination with the ceiling or head to the restroom the moment the waiter appeared with the check. If forced to pay, he would scrutinize the bill with forensic intensity, challenging every item to ensure he wasn't being overcharged by a single penny. He loathed the rock star tradition of buying rounds of drinks for the entourage, preferring to let others pick up the tab while he enjoyed the benefits of their generosity. His aversion to parting with cash also drove his biggest life decision of the decade, becoming a tax exile. In 1975, facing the Labour government's punitive tax rates, which could reach 83%, Rod fled Britain for Los Angeles. While many stars made this move, Rod was vocal about his refusal to pay what he considered theft by the state. He uprooted his entire life not for the sunshine, but to protect his bottom line. He famously stated that he did not want to see his hard-earned money wasted, framing his departure as a matter of principle, though critics saw it as the ultimate act of greed. Even his romantic life was governed by a strict financial code. While he showered his partners with affection, he was careful not to shower them with too many unmonitored gifts. He was a man who knew the price of everything and the value of keeping it in his own bank account. Rod Stewart proved that you could wear the flashiest clothes and drive the fastest cars, yet still possess the soul of a miser, ensuring that while the champagne flowed, it was usually someone else paying for it. Frankie Howard. The fourth figure in our chronicle of the wealthy who pleaded poverty is a man whose comedic genius was defined by his stuttering delivery, his weary expressions, and his absolute mastery of the double entendre. Frankie Howard was a national treasure in Britain during the 1970s, a comedian whose career revival with the hit series Up Pompeii made him one of the highest-paid entertainers on television. To the viewing public, he was the lovable, slightly shambolic uncle who poked fun at the establishment with a wink and a nod. However, behind the "titter ye not" catchphrases and the warm stage persona lay a man who was consumed by a crippling, almost Dickensian fear of financial ruin. Despite the fact that his bank accounts were overflowing with royalties, appearance fees, and earnings from lucrative summer pantomimes, Frankie lived his life as if the bailiffs were permanently parked at his front gate. He did not just save money. He guarded it with a level of secrecy and anxiety that became the stuff of industry legend. Throughout the decade, Frankie Howard cultivated an image of a man who was constantly down on his luck. In interviews, he would frequently bemoan his financial state, complaining about the crippling taxes and the high cost of living, leading many fans to believe he was struggling. The reality, however, was starkly different. He was a multimillionaire who chose to live in a state of self-imposed austerity. At his home, Wavering Down in Somerset, which he shared with his partner and manager Dennis Hamer, the heating was rationed with a severity that would have impressed a wartime warden. Guests who stayed the weekend often reported that the house was kept at a temperature that required them to wear coats indoors, as Frankie viewed central heating as a frivolous luxury rather than a basic necessity. He would patrol the hallways, switching off lights and unplugging appliances, convinced that the electricity meter was spinning too fast, draining his hard-earned fortune away. His wardrobe was another area where his extreme thrift was visible to all. While other stars of his magnitude were visiting Savile Row for bespoke suits, Frankie was famously reluctant to spend money on clothes. He would wear jumpers and jackets until they were literally fraying at the seams, often relying on the wardrobe departments of his television shows to provide him with decent attire for public appearances. There were whispers in the studios that he would sometimes borrow items from the set, small props, toiletries, or costume pieces, to avoid having to purchase them himself. When dining out, which was a rare occurrence, he was a master of the fumble, a tactical delay in finding his wallet that usually resulted in someone else paying the bill. If he did pay, the tip was calculated with a mathematical precision designed to leave the absolute minimum required by social convention. This profound inability to enjoy his wealth was rooted in his deep-seated insecurities. Frankie had endured a long period in the wilderness before his 70s comeback, and the memory of those lean years haunted him. He was terrified that his popularity was a fluke that could vanish overnight, leaving him destitute. Furthermore, as a closeted gay man in an era where such things were still largely stigmatized, he lived with a constant paranoia that he was vulnerable to blackmail. His money was his shield, his protection against a world he found unpredictable. When he passed away, his estate was valued at well over £1 million, a fortune he had spent decades pretending he did not possess. He left behind a legacy of laughter, but for himself, he had created a golden cage of frugality. Arthur Lowe. The fifth name on our list belongs to the man who gave us the most iconic portrayal of pompous authority in the history of British television. Arthur Lowe was the face of Dad's Army, the actor who brought the blustering Captain Mainwaring to life with such perfection that the line between the character and the man often seemed to blur. By the mid-70s, the sitcom was a national institution, attracting audiences of 18 million people, and Arthur was arguably the biggest television star in the country. He commanded fees that were astronomical for the era, supplemented by lucrative voiceover work. Yet, despite his considerable wealth, Arthur Lowe possessed a reputation for tight-fistedness that became the stuff of legend among his fellow cast members. He was a man who played a bank manager on screen, but in real life, he acted like a man who was terrified the bank was about to close forever. The most famous stories about Arthur's reluctance to part with his money revolve around the social rituals of the cast. The Dad's Army team was a close-knit group, but Arthur's participation came with a noticeable caveat. It was widely whispered in the industry that he suffered from a severe case of short arms and deep pockets. His co-stars, particularly the generous John Le Mesurier, would recount with amused exasperation how Arthur would happily accept drinks bought by others all night long. However, the moment it was his turn to buy a round, Arthur would perform a vanishing act worthy of Houdini. He would suddenly remember an urgent telephone call, or check his watch and declare he had an early start, retreating to his hotel room and leaving his colleagues to settle the tab. This became a running joke on set, earning him a reputation as the Phantom of the Bar. His parsimony extended into his professional demands. Arthur was notoriously difficult when negotiating contracts, demanding top-tier expenses while refusing to spend a penny of his own money on his comfort while working. He treated the BBC accounts department as his personal treasury, battling over minor expense claims with the tenacity of a bulldog. While he eventually purchased a classic steam yacht, the Amazon, as a status symbol, even this luxury was managed with an iron grip. He enjoyed the prestige of the boat, but loathed the running costs, constantly complaining about the price of fuel and crew wages. The psychology behind Arthur's extreme thrift was complex. Unlike some stars who found fame early, Arthur Lowe was a late bloomer who had spent decades as a jobbing actor earning a meager wage. When he finally struck gold in his 50s, he could not shake the siege mentality of his early years. He lived in constant fear that his success was a temporary glitch and that he would return to obscurity. This anxiety drove him to hoard his earnings, viewing every pound spent as a pound lost forever. He died in 1982, leaving a substantial estate that proved he had indeed counted every penny. Arthur Lowe remains a fascinating paradox, a man who became rich playing a character who obsessed over social standing while he himself obsessed over the price of the tea. Tommy Cooper. The sixth name in our dossier of the distinguished tightwads is a man whose physical presence was as overwhelming as his talent, a 6'4" giant in a red fez who dominated the landscape of British variety in the 1970s. Tommy Cooper was the master of the failed magic trick, a comedian whose seemingly chaotic performances were actually the result of meticulous timing and genius. By the middle of the decade, he was one of the highest-paid entertainers in the United Kingdom, commanding appearance fees that would have made a banker blush. He was a television staple, a sellout stage attraction, and a man who generated cash as easily as he pulled rabbits out of hats. Yet, behind the bumbling persona and the roar of the applause, Tommy Cooper was a man who possessed a pathological reluctance to spend his own money, elevating the art of stinginess to a level that was almost as famous as his act. The stories of Tommy's interactions with taxi drivers are the stuff of industry folklore, repeated in dressing rooms across the country. He was a frequent user of cabs to ferry him between theatres and the various drinking dens of London, but the journey's end was always a moment of dread for the driver. Legend has it that upon arriving at his destination, Tommy would lean forward with a conspiratorial wink, pressing a small, folded object into the driver's hand. He would whisper in his signature raspy voice, "Have a drink on me, son." The driver, expecting a generous tip from a national superstar, would wait until Tommy had lumbered away before opening his hand, only to discover that the drink was not a banknote, but a literal tea bag. For Tommy, this was a hilarious gag that saved him a few shillings. For the drivers, it was a bewildering encounter with a millionaire who treated a penny like a gold sovereign. His behavior in the pubs and clubs of the West End was equally notorious. Tommy had a prodigious thirst and spent a significant portion of his life in bars, yet he was famously allergic to the concept of buying a round. Witnesses recounted a theatrical performance that occurred whenever the barman shouted, "Last orders." Tommy, who had been happily consuming drinks bought by adoring fans and fellow comics all night, would suddenly develop a fascinating inability to locate his wallet. He would pat his pockets with a look of mock panic, mumbling about leaving his money in his other suit, or simply vanish into the restroom until the danger of paying had passed. It was a well-known hazard of drinking with Cooper. You would enjoy the company of a genius, but you would inevitably pay for the privilege. This extreme parsimony was juxtaposed with a strange habit of hoarding physical cash. Tommy was known to carry large rolls of banknotes on his person, secured with rubber bands, yet he would practically weep if he had to break into one of them. He lived in a chaotic domestic situation, caught between a wife and a mistress, and perhaps money was the one thing he felt he could control in a life that was spiraling due to his health. He treated cash not as a means of exchange, but as a security blanket to be clutched tight against the world. He died as he lived, in the middle of a performance in 1984, leaving behind a legacy of laughter and a small army of taxi drivers who still had a teabag in their glove compartment, a dry souvenir from the funniest and stingiest magician who ever lived, Charles Hawtrey. The seventh figure in our chronicle of the wealthy parsimonious is a man whose stick-thin frame, round spectacles, and patrician accent made him one of the most distinctive eccentrics in the history of British comedy. Charles Hawtrey was a cornerstone of the Carry On franchise, an actor who could steal a scene with a single withering look or a camp gesture. By the 1970s, he was a household name, commanding fees that should have secured him a life of absolute comfort and elegance. However, the reality of Charles's existence was a stark, almost Dickensian contrast to his on-screen persona of the posh, oblivious gentleman. He was a man who possessed a significant fortune but chose to live in a state of chaotic frugality, treating his money as a score to be kept rather than a resource to be used, eventually becoming a recluse in a seaside town where his refusal to spend arguably cost him his dignity. In his later years, Charles moved to Deal in Kent, purchasing a historic property known as Porter's Lodge. To the locals, he was a figure of immense curiosity, a famous star who lived like a pauper. Despite having the funds to renovate the house into a palace, Charles refused to spend money on basic maintenance. He allowed the property to fall into a state of disrepair, with peeling paint and overgrown gardens, simply because he could not bear the thought of paying builders or decorators. He famously refused to install central heating, viewing it as an exorbitant and unnecessary expense. Instead, during the bitter coastal winters, he would wear multiple layers of old, moth-eaten jumpers and huddle around a small, dangerous paraffin heater, risking his safety to save a few pounds on the gas bill. This extreme thrift created a living environment that was shocking to the few visitors he allowed across the threshold, a dusty, cold monument to his unwillingness to part with his cash. His relationship with the local economy was equally strained. Charles was a familiar sight in the pubs of Deal, but he was the antithesis of the generous celebrity. He would arrive for his daily, liquid lunch, often consuming large quantities of gin, but he would scrutinize the change given by the bar staff with the intensity of a forensic accountant. He was known to argue over the price of a drink if it had gone up by a mere penny since his last visit, creating scenes that were both tragic and comic. He never bought rounds for the locals who stared at him, and he certainly never tipped. On the rare occasions he took a taxi home when his legs were too unsteady to walk, he would haggle with the driver before getting into the car, trying to secure a fixed price that was lower than the meter rate. If the driver refused, Charles would often attempt to walk, a stubborn refusal to pay full price that demonstrated his chaotic priorities. The tragedy of Charles Hawtrey's greed was that it was rooted in a deep, festering resentment. He believed he was a serious dramatic actor who had been trapped in low-brow comedy, and he felt the world owed him something. He hoarded his money as a form of control in a life where he felt professionally undervalued. When a fire broke out in his home in the 80s, caused in part by his chaotic living conditions, he was more concerned with rescuing his trousers, where he kept his wallet, than his own physical safety. He famously refused to be taken to the hospital until he had secured his valuables. When he died in 1988, he left a substantial estate, money that had sat gathering dust while he lived in the cold. He was the ultimate miser of the seaside, a star who died with a full bank account but an empty life. Ken Dodd. The eighth figure in our dossier of the fiercely frugal is a man whose wild hair, protruding teeth, and tickling stick made him a figure of pure chaotic joy for generations of Britons. Ken Dodd was not just a comedian, he was a stamina machine, touring the country relentlessly throughout the 1970s. During this decade, he was indisputably one of the highest-earning entertainers in the United Kingdom, selling millions of records and packing theaters night after night. Yet, Despite an income that rivaled that of major industrialists, the Squire of Knotty Ash lived a life that was bafflingly disconnected from his immense wealth. Ken Dodd was the ultimate hoarder, a man who did not trust the banking system or the taxman, preferring to keep his cash close, literally under his bed. While other stars of the 70s were purchasing sprawling country manors, Ken continued to live in the same semi-detached Georgian farmhouse in Liverpool where he had been born. He never moved and famously refused to spend money on renovating the property. Visitors described a house frozen in time, filled with decades of accumulated props and unopened fan mail. It was a fortress of solitude where the heating was rarely turned on and the furnishings were worn threadbare. Ken saw no reason to replace a chair that still stood. To him, the house was a sanctuary, and spending money on fancy interior design was a vanity he simply did not understand. His attitude towards travel expenses was legendary. Despite being a multimillionaire, Ken loathed the idea of spending money on hotels. After a show, no matter where he was in the country, be it London or Glasgow, he would often drive through the night back to Liverpool. He would rather drive for 5 hours at 3 in the morning than pay for a hotel room. On the rare occasions when he did stay in a hotel, he was known to negotiate the rate with the tenacity of a market trader, arguing that since he was arriving late and leaving early, he should not have to pay the full price. The true extent of his hoarding only became public knowledge later, but the habits were formed in the 70s. Ken had a deep, pathological mistrust of accountants. He preferred cash, bundles of banknotes that he could see, touch, and count. It was an open secret that he often asked to be paid in cash, and this money did not always find its way to a bank vault. Instead, he stashed it in suitcases and under floorboards in his Knotty Ash home. He treated his earnings like a squirrel gathering nuts for a winter that lasted a lifetime. He was terrified of losing what he had built, a fear that stemmed from his father's warnings about the fragility of show business. This obsession led to a lifestyle that was almost hermetic. He did not buy expensive clothes or take lavish holidays. Ken Dodd died in 2018, leaving behind a massive fortune. But his life in the 70s remains a study of a man who conquered the world of entertainment but remained a prisoner of his own wallet. Wilfrid Brambell. The ninth figure in our dossier of the distinguished tightwads is a man who became an icon by playing the most famous miser in British television history, only to find that the lines between his character and his reality were uncomfortably blurred. Wilfrid Brambell was the actor behind Albert Steptoe, the dirty old man of the colossal sitcom Steptoe and Son. To the 20 million viewers who tuned in every week during the 1970s, he was the embodiment of grime, greed, and poverty, a rag-and-bone man who would fight his own son for a pickled onion. However, in real life, Wilfrid was a dapper, educated man who wore bespoke suits and spoke with a refined accent. Yet, despite the vast fortune that the show's global success brought him, he harbored a financial paranoia that rivaled that of the fictional character he portrayed, living a life of strange contradictions where he counted every penny while sitting on a gold mine. By the mid-70s, Wilfrid Brambell was one of the highest-paid actors on the BBC. The immense popularity of Steptoe and Son had led to 2 hit feature films and lucrative tours, filling his bank accounts with royalties. Yet, those who worked with him often noted a profound reluctance to enjoy this wealth. He lived in a relatively modest flat in Pimlico, London, which, while certainly cleaner than the Steptoe junkyard, was far from the luxurious mansion one would expect for a star of his magnitude. He resisted the trappings of the celebrity lifestyle, viewing property investments and lavish cars as dangerous liabilities. His only significant expenditure was on gin, a vice that consumed him. But even here, he was known to hunt for the best prices, treating his addiction with the budgetary strictness of a household manager. His reputation for frugality on set was well known and often a source of friction. While his co-star, Harry H. Corbett, was known for his generosity and open nature, Wilfrid was famously withdrawn and protective of his earnings. There were whispers in the canteen that he would scrutinize his pay packets with forensic intensity, arguing over minor deductions or expenses that he felt were unjust. He had a deep-seated fear of the taxman, a common phobia in the 70s, but in Wilfrid's case, it bordered on obsession. He was terrified that the government would strip him of his security, leaving him as destitute as the character he played. This fear drove him to hoard his cash, keeping his liquidity high and his spending visibly low, creating a fortress of savings that he rarely dipped into for pleasure. Socially, Wilfred was a complex figure. He could be charming, but when the bill arrived at a restaurant or bar, the charm often evaporated. He was a master of the slow reach, allowing others to cover the cost of meals and drinks, a habit that alienated many in the industry. He would often complain about the cost of living in London, lamenting the price of theatre tickets or taxis to anyone who would listen, despite being in the top 1% of earners in the country. This stinginess was not born of malice, but of a deep, isolating insecurity. As a gay man in an era that was still hostile to his identity, and an actor who feared being typecast, money was his only true safety net. He eventually died in 1985, leaving a substantial estate that surprised many who had seen his modest lifestyle. Wilfred Brambell proved that you can leave the rag and bone yard, but the fear of having nothing never truly leaves you, turning a millionaire actor into a man who guards his wallet as if it were his last possession, Mick Jagger. The final name in our ledger of the spectacularly thrifty brings us to the very pinnacle of rock and roll royalty, a man whose lips and hips defined the 1970s, but whose brain was firmly focused on the bottom line. Mick Jagger is known to the world as the charismatic frontman of the Rolling Stones, the ultimate rebel who sang about street fighting men and sympathy for the devil. However, behind the swagger and the velvet jumpsuits lay a mind that possessed the cold, calculating precision of a seasoned forensic accountant. While his bandmate Keith Richards was living the chaotic life of a rock pirate, unaware of where his money was going, Mick was busy transforming the band into a ruthless corporate machine. He was the first rock star to realize that the music business was, above all, a business, and he treated his personal fortune with a level of protectiveness that bordered on the obsessive. The defining moment of Mick's financial philosophy occurred in 1971, when the band famously fled the United Kingdom to escape the punitive tax rates of the Labour government. This was not merely a lifestyle choice, it was a calculated fiscal evacuation. Mick uprooted the entire Rolling Stones operation to the south of France, leading to the recording of Exile on Main Saint. While this is remembered as an artistic triumph, for Mick, it was primarily a tax-saving strategy. He was determined not to let the government take 93% of his earnings, famously stating that he refused to work for pennies. This move set the tone for the rest of the decade. Every artistic decision was weighed against its financial implication. He became the de facto manager of the group, scrutinizing contracts and tour budgets with a magnifying glass, ensuring that promoters and agents were not skimming the cream off the top. His reputation for personal thrift is legendary within the music industry. Despite earning millions from record-breaking tours in 1972 and 1975, Mick was known for his reluctance to part with cash in social situations. There are numerous anecdotes from the era describing dinners where the bill would arrive and the wealthiest man at the table would suddenly become invisible. He famously monitored the merchandising sales with an eagle eye, knowing exactly how many t-shirts were sold in every city, ensuring that not a single dollar went missing. Even in his romantic life, which was splashed across the tabloids, he was known for being careful with gifts, preferring gestures that did not require a significant capital outlay. He applied the logic of the London School of Economics, where he had briefly studied, to the chaotic world of rock and roll. This intense focus on money preservation created a strange duality. On stage, he was the wild, uninhibited performer throwing water over the crowd. Backstage, he was the somber executive checking the receipts. He viewed the band not just as a musical outfit, but as a brand to be protected and monetized. While many of his peers from the 1970s ended up bankrupt, swindled by managers, or destitute due to their own excesses, Mick Jagger's fortune only grew. He hoarded his wealth by controlling every aspect of his empire, refusing to let sentimentality interfere with profitability. He closes our list as the ultimate example of the financial hawk of rock, a man who seduced the world with his image but kept his wallet firmly snapped shut, proving that in the end, the person who counts the pennies is the one who laughs last.